Centrally located along the southern Atlantic coast, just south of Savannah, Georgia, lies Sapelo Island. Largely undeveloped and steeped in rich history, this small barrier island is recognized as home to the last intact Gullah Geechee community in the nation, Hog Hummock. Today, the island is home to fewer than 50 full-time residents, many of whom are direct descendants of once enslaved West Africans brought over by European settlers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to cultivate land and build structures for the landowners.
"15 years ago, my father called me, joined with a couple of the elders on the island, and asked me to take an assessment of our survival here on Sapelo Island. That alone was pretty heavy to me. I've been coming to this island for 57 years. That's a pretty heavy call to find out what the percentage levels is of your survival rate on an island that your family members have been living on and thriving from 1802.
Most of the names of the descendants, their last names, originated from the tasks that were done on the plantation. The Baileys baled the hay, the indigo, the cotton. The Grosvenors tended to the groves. The Walkers walked the livestock, etc., etc.
The history says to us that the land is the reason we're here today. I was raised to live from the land as a part of a definition of indigenous. It's because you're living off the land.
The main thing for this island is to unveil all of the illegalities that has happened to the people on Sapelo. The stealing of the land. As we know, history, black people were treated as property. However, after the Civil War, we became freedmen and we were able to purchase our land. My family probably could date back maybe 8 or 9 generations from West Africa to Sapelo Island. And so in order to keep that and maintain that, we're gonna have to keep the land by whatever means necessary.
Of the 13 ancestral settlements on Sapelo Island, only one remains that is occupied by the Gullah Geechee descendants. That is Hog Hummock. Raccoon Bluff was the last one to be left.
The history of land ownership on Sapelo Island has been marked by land theft. After the Civil War, a number of the freed enslaved people came back to Sapelo Island and through the Freedmen's Bureau and other mechanisms purchased the land on Sapelo Island. In the early 1900s, first Howard Coffin, an automobile magnate from Detroit, and then R.J. Reynolds, famous for his tobacco, discovered the island. Thought it was spectacular and wanted to have their own playground there. And what they did through a number of nefarious mechanisms is steal the land from the Gullah Geechee. We saw deeds that were supposedly signed by people who were 3 years old. We saw deeds that were supposedly signed by a school teacher with an X, as if she couldn't write her or sign her own name. R.J. Reynolds and Mr. Coffin, they controlled all of the economy on the island. And so they would force the Gullah Geechee people, if you want a job, you have to swap this nice 10-acre plot of land you have up in an area called Raccoon Bluff for this half-acre parcel down in Hog Hammock, which was the more marshy of the island. Through those sorts of mechanisms, R.J. Reynolds ultimately owned, at least according to the county records, the vast majority of the island. Then when R.J. Reynolds died, his wife passed that land on to the state. So the entire island is approximately 16,000 acres, and Hog Hummock makes up just a little over 400 acres of that entire island. So currently the state owns 97% of the island, and the Gullah Geechee people have been forced into this one small area called Hog Hummock, even though 8, 9, 10 decades ago, the Gullah Geechee people owned the entire island.
The pivotal moment for realizing that we needed not just a legal mind, but a legal team came when we filed the Housing and Urban Development Discrimination Complaint. At that moment, I knew I had to get some legal counsel.
So back in 2012, I was sitting in my office when I got an emergency phone call from a paralegal who said, "I just hung up with a man named Reginald Hall, and you need to hear his story. I think this is a case we're going to want to take." I called up Mr. Hall and heard what turned out to be an extraordinary story and really unbelievable here in the 21st century, that there was a island of Gullah Geechee people who were being entirely neglected by the governments that were supposed to be providing them services.
Attorney Colfax, I believe at the moment he got the phone call, respected the magnitude. It couldn't have been more than a week or two and he was here on the island. From that point on, he's not left our side.
Between 2011 and 2012, the county imposed a humongous tax hike on the residents of Sapelo Island. People's taxes went from paying $500 a year to something like paying $5,000 a year. So an increase of 1,000% or a tenfold increase. Combined with that, they were receiving no services from the county.
In dealing with the taxes, when the tax bill comes out, it gives you an assessment of what your property tax is going to be. And that is the first notification that we received, that, you're not expecting taxes to go up but a certain percentage each year, but when it goes up way beyond your imagination, it's time to do something about it.
McIntosh County was making an effort to drive the Gullah Geechee population off the island, because there's no way that the Gullah Geechee people, many of whom were elderly and on fixed incomes, could afford these very, very significant tax hikes, meaning that their properties were going to go up for tax sale. Land speculators would come in, purchase those parcels, and put up the vacation homes that are now very commonplace in Hilton Head and St. Simons and Defusky Island. All of these former Gullah Geechee communities that have been completely wiped out and are now the playgrounds of the well-off.
Still, we're paying for services that we're not receiving. I'm 63 years old, and it can be very difficult for trash service. Everything that's at your house that needs to go to the trash, you have to load that up on a truck, take it to a dumpster, pick it up, and dump it.
What we learned is that the municipal services that one typically expects to be given by the government were simply not happening on the island.
I remember a time when a bunch of kids were over here and they were having a good time, and one of the kids was in an accident. That kid ended up dying on the route to the hospital, because the amount of time that it takes for a helicopter to get over here, the amount of people that had to gather themselves, they had to light up the landing strip so they would know where they were. There are a lot of services that the mainland enjoy that we had to fight to try to even get it to the level that we have it at right now.
The stark difference between the lack of services being provided on the island, which is predominantly, almost exclusively Gullah Geechee and Black, as compared to the services that were being provided on the mainland, which was predominantly white, we thought Yes, all the markings are there for a discrimination case. We mounted a challenge and filed claims on behalf of about 50 Sapelo Island property owners challenging the tax hikes that happened between 2011 and 2012. Those went on for some period of time, but eventually the county relented and rolled back the taxes to just above the level they were in 2011, which was critical to the survival of the Gullah Geechee population on the island.
We filed the case ultimately in 2015, and it was against both the state of Georgia and McIntosh County. Almost immediately, both defendants moved to dismiss, and so they raised a number of arguments amounting essentially to the idea that nothing that we had said was a legal claim and should be allowed to move forward. The court issued a couple of decisions on those, and it was mixed. What was good for us was that the court said, no, these are legal claims. If the county is discriminating based on race in providing municipal services, that is a violation. It's a constitutional violation. It's a violation of some of the oldest civil rights laws in the country. And so you can move forward on those claims. Same with the Americans with Disabilities Act claims against the state. The court said, what you're talking about is a problem. You should have a chance to prove it up. You know, the inquiry that the court had to answer and that we had to show discriminatory intent is really far-reaching, and they look really at all of the circumstantial evidence they can. So they look at every decision that the county commissioners have made over the years, statements the county commissioners have said, and who they've appointed to boards. So in order to answer that question, we took over 100 depositions, we exchanged hundreds of thousands of pages of discovery, and really aimed at showing this rolled up to the same thing, which was discriminatory intent. And it was really powerful to have Gullah Geechee descendants sit across from a lawyer for the county and say, I know this is race discrimination. There's no other reason that this would be happening.
They make the laws, but they don't enforce the laws. If they're allowing this to happen, what is the penalty for breaking these laws that they wrote, breaking the codes that they made up?
In our briefing, we were really pointing to the past many, many decades of McIntosh County's conduct, going from an all-white board of commissioners to having sort of a hand-selected single black commissioner when it was to the county's advantage with federal funding to do so. And really, there's sort of an unbroken pattern of race discrimination by the county board of commissioners that stretches back well into the 20th century.
Some of the tactics and the levels that was used to depopulate us looks like economics. How do we deprive the economics on the island? Well, the best way to do that is take the jobs away. Make sure that the jobs are not anything that could grow past servitude. Let's take the medical facility and close it down. Let's take the school and close it down. Let's make sure that the transportation is so discombobulated that you can't make heads or tails of it.
The ferry only runs 3 times a day on and off the island. If you have a job on the mainland, chances are that job and the hours in which the ferry runs may not be conducive to you leaving the island for a job.
The claims there were under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Many of the folks who live on the island and many people who would like to visit relatives on the island are elderly. Many folks have mobility issues.
There have been many occasions where the handicap had to be picked up by men and brought onto the boat.
So the state approached us about settling, and our view at that point was the claims against the state predominantly focused on the ferry. We felt that if we could reach a good resolution on the ferry sort of sooner rather than later, that would be really meaningful for people living on the island. We were ultimately able to reach an agreement with the state for improvements to the ferry, for some monetary compensation. We hoped sort of a change in the way that the state does business with Gullah Geechee folks living on Sapelo. Because the state controls so much land on the island, they are sort of necessarily in a long-term relationship with the Hog-Hammock community. County realized that they might have to try the case in Savannah. They became very serious about settlement and came to us and asked if we would be interested in finding a way to resolve the case without going to trial. We ended up having a 14-hour settlement conversation. The county agreed to dramatic increases in road maintenance to explore ways of making sure that the roads would be able to withstand rain better than they currently are. The county was providing sufficient maintenance that they could be safe to travel. With respect to the fire equipment, they agreed through the settlement to ensure that it was really comparable to what it was in other parts of the county. With respect to medical services, they agreed to put an emergency medical vehicle on the island, which can be really critical for time-sensitive, life-saving care, and an agreement to provide training for folks who are on the island. Finally, with respect to trash, they agreed to lower the trash fee. So one of the things that had just been so outrageous was that folks on Sapelo were paying exactly the same trash fee as people in the county, and where on the mainland that got you curbside pickup, on Sapelo it got you nothing. I think it was very meaningful for family members who were still alive to carry that legacy out. One of our plaintiffs who died, his wife said that he never got to see the fixed docks, he never got to see the improvements, but when she saw them, she knew that his work was living on.
You have the county agreeing to provide services on the island in a way that they've never done in the history of the island.
The battle that was won against the state of Georgia in 2020 and the county of McIntosh in 2022 were certainly a success and created a space for more descendants to be a part of the revolution that will actually change the course of history on Sapelo Island.
Here you have one of the last intact communities of Gullah Geechee people in the country that is just being shunted aside in favor of developers coming in and creating vacation homes on this undeniably beautiful island. But in the process, you're destroying a history, a community, a culture that we will never see again.
And so we're gonna have to create jobs and create opportunities for people to come back here and live. The island will survive, and the descendants will survive.
So if you look at all of these processes that we can put in place in the creation of now teaching our children, their children, and the next 10 generations to keep this community as the last intact Gullah Geechee community on any coast of any part of this United States is still part of this American fabric. So why not preserve it?
The next steps for the success, ongoing success of the Gullah Geechee community on Sapelo Island is economic development. That community needs to have its own economy, its own way of life on the island that can be, to a certain extent, self-sustaining. A big step toward that goal is the provision of services, having the ferry operate in a way that kids can go to school, that family members can have jobs on the mainland and still being able to get back home. And then the last step, and perhaps the biggest hurdle of all, is getting land back to the Gullah Geechee community that has been stolen from them over the decades.
So much has already been achieved, thanks to the dedicated efforts of community advocates across the region. Now, the work continues to preserve and protect the Gullah Geechee descendants of Sapelo Island.